there! Welcome to this week's Accessibility Byte. Today, we're diving into accessible tables, a key skill for making content clear and easy to navigate for all users, including those using assistive technology. By the end of this lesson, you'll know what makes a table accessible and why it matters, the essential components of an accessible table, how to structure and format tables in Microsoft and Canvas, and why meaningful table headers, captions, and alt text matter. Let's get started. Tables help organize information visually, making it easier to understand relationships between data. However, without proper structure, tables can be confusing or unreadable for those using screen readers. Let's start with understanding when to use a table. Tables work best when used for presenting and analyzing data. Tables should not be used for design layout purposes, as this creates accessibility barriers. A screen reader reads a table cell by cell, starting in the top left corner and moving right then down. Using tables for layout often means that information isn't organized in the same logical manner, so the reading order becomes disrupted. Now, let's talk about building an accessible table. To get started, always use the Insert Table tool. This ensures the table has the necessary metadata for accessibility applied. Next, designate the row and column headers, even if they're visually obvious. Explicit header designations help screen readers understand the table's structure. Some screen readers even call out the row and column name before reading the data. It's important to keep a simple structure and avoid merged or split cells, as these can confuse users or trip up screen readers. It's best practice to flatten the table whenever possible to ensure readability. Did you know tables also have captions and alt text? These are just as important as the header designations and add to the accessibility of the information. Table captions are visible and provide a quick summary of what the table is about. Table alt text is hidden and used by screen readers to describe the table's content. For example, a table with financial data may have a caption that reads monthly sales for 2024, giving all users a quick idea of what's inside. The alt text, on the other hand, could read monthly sales figures spanning 2024, with columns for each month of the year and rows for different product categories. This extra detail helps screen reader users understand the table's content. Finally, check your table properties to ensure it's formatted to maximize accessibility. Let's talk about where to find these settings and review everything else we've discussed in the demonstration next.
Let's start by getting a sense of how we navigate a table using a screen reader and what that experience is like. In this example table, we're looking at a course schedule and topics overview. This table is organized according to the header row, which is the first row at the very top. I can identify this as the header row as a sighted user because the font is bolded. I can also gather how large the table is and how much information it is just by seeing how many columns and how many rows there are. For this demonstration, I'll be using the NVDA screen reader. Let's have a listen.
Table with 11 rows and 5 columns, row 1, column 1 week.
NVDA lets the user know how large the table is, how many columns, and how many rows, and then starts us off by reading out what is in the very first cell in the upper left. I can navigate with the arrow keys, moving from cell to cell.
Column 2 date range, column 3 topic, column 4 required reading, column 5 assignments/exams.
NVDA is reading out not only the information that's inside of the cell as I'm moving along, but also where it's located in the overall context of the columns in the table. Because this table was formatted with a designated header row, NVDA is also going to tell me which header the content cells will fall under as I navigate through them. For example,
topic column 3 introduction to underwater basket weaving. Required reading column 4 chapter 1.
As you heard, as I'm moving through the content in the table, NVDA first tells me which header each of the content cells falls underneath. That way I can get the full context of that information and how it relates to other information in the table. Now we'll take a look at a page that's used a table for layout or design reasons, rather than conveying the relationship between information. This page is styled as a sort of home page or first page of a syllabus. So let's hear how that sounds with NVDA.
Page 1 region table with 6 rows and 2 columns, row 1, column 1 welcome to.
So even though the amount of rows and columns here doesn't really matter, NVDA is still going to read them out because that's how it's programmed to interact with this type of content. Let's continue and see what it's like to just scan through this page in order.
Welcome to blank. Row 2, a close-up of the bottom of a woven basket. Column 2, underwater basket weaving 101. Blank. Row 3, welcome to column 1, course description. Blank. Column 2. Row 4, course description. Welcome to column 1. This course introduces students to the fundamentals of basket weaving techniques applied in a fully submerged environment. Blank. Row 5, required materials. Column 2, course info. Waterproof sketchpad, bullet. Reed, seagrass, and rattan.
As you may have heard, NVDA will scan through a table in order from top to bottom, left to right. This means that some of my content was not read in the order that I intended it to be. For example, my welcome to, that's the header at the very top, was interrupted by the image that I have inserted in the second row, first column. We also heard in some places, welcome to being read out before the content of a cell. That's because the welcome to cell at the top is the header. This, in combination with a lot of blanks being read out due to merged cells, can make navigating and understanding this page really confusing for a user because NVDA is also confused. Now let's see how we can create a table with accessibility in mind using Microsoft Word. For the full range of tools, we recommend using the desktop version of Microsoft Word rather than the online version. We'll start by placing your cursor anywhere in the page that you want to place your table. Then, from the Insert tab in the toolbar, select Table. In the dialog box that opens, you can designate the dimensions of your table by how many rows and how many columns you want. You can always add more or delete some later. Once your table's been created, the Table Design tab in the toolbar will open. In here is where you can designate whether your table is going to be arranged by a header row, first column, or both a header row and first column. A header row is the first row in a table. Each cell in this row acts as a header for all of the information that falls below it. For example, in this table, we have a header row that has pet name in the first cell. That lets us know that all of the cells that fall below that header are pet names. First column, or a header column, does the same thing but for the rows. For example, the first column in this table lists the different pet names. But because it's also a first column or a header column, each of these cells organizes the information in the rows adjacent to them. For example, the header column cell that says the name Kermit lets us know that all of the information in that row applies to the pet Kermit. Looking back under the Table Design tab in Word, you'll see Table Styles. This gives you some pre-formatted shading options for your table to make your headers a little bit more visually apparent. If you decide to change the shading manually or your font colors manually, make sure that you also keep in mind your accessible contrast ratios. One of the benefits of using the pre-formatted table shading options is that if you choose something with alternating colors, when you add or delete rows or columns, it'll maintain that same shading option as you work. For other accessibility options, click and drag your cursor from the bottom rightmost corner of your table all the way up to the upper left to highlight all rows and all columns. Then right-click anywhere in the table and select Table Properties. With all of the rows and columns selected, under the Row tab in Table Properties, we want to make sure that the option for Allow Row to break across pages is unchecked. This means that if you have a row that is interrupted from one page to the next page, it won't be broken in half. The option right below that, which says Repeat as Header Row at the top of each page, needs to be applied to your header row. Currently, my entire table is highlighted. I don't want to check this box to apply it to all of my rows, only the header row. To do that, I can use the up and down arrows right below the checkboxes to navigate to the header row. Once my cursor is in the header row, I can then check the box for Repeat as Header Row at the top of each page. This means that as my table grows longer, if it carries on to a following page, or if someone opens it on a different version of Word or a different device, and the reflow makes my table extend beyond one page, the header row will appear at the top of each page that my table is on. The last tab in the Table Properties menu is Alt Text. Here is where you can write a title and description that will be read out by screen readers when they interact with this table. For this one, I am titling it Weekly Schedule, and in the description, I'm describing the visual organization of the table, days of the week in columns. To add a caption to your table, place your cursor anywhere in the table, and from the toolbar at the top, select References. In this tab, you'll locate an option called Insert Caption. By default, Word should select the label as being a table. You can check the box for Exclude Label from Captions, which just means that the word table will not appear at the start of your caption. There's also a drop-down for Position, which will change whether your caption appears above the table or below the table. In the Caption field is where you will type the actual caption that will appear. For this table, I'm captioning it Weekly Schedule. When you click OK, you'll see your caption appear. Now let's create a table in Canvas with accessibility in mind. To add a table, choose Table from the toolbar, and just like in Word, when you hover your cursor over Table, it'll give you a grid that allows you to select how many rows and how many columns you'd like your table to be. Once your table is inserted, you may notice 2 flags in the accessibility checker below. Clicking on the accessibility checker will give you the option to add a caption for your table. When you click Apply, it'll move to the next issue, which is setting your table's headers. You have the option from the dropdown to select a header row, a header column, or both header row and column. With those designated, you can start filling out the information in your table. As I'm typing in the text for my header row, I can see that the font is bold. This is done automatically because I've designated my table is organized by the header row. Unlike in Word, Canvas does not provide us with colorful style options for tables. To add shading to your table, you would have to do this manually for each row that you want to change the color of. To do this, you can place your cursor in the row that you want to change the color of, select Table from the toolbar at the top, go to Row, and then Row Properties. Under the Advanced tab, you can then change the background color. If I change the background color of a row to something that has poor contrast with the text, the accessibility checker will flag each cell that contrast issue occurs in. I can then use the accessibility checker side panel to adjust the font in each of these cells. It's important to note that while accessibility checkers are helpful tools, they can't understand the context of what you put inside of a table. This means that they won't be able to tell us if a table is used incorrectly. It's up to us as the creators of content to make sure that we're using tables for their intended purpose, which is to display data or information and not using them to design page layouts. Using tables for design layout can create barriers for those who use assistive technology. If you're working on a page with a specific design or layout in mind and you'd like support on making it accessible, you can book a one-on-one consultation with an instructional designer.
I hope you found this helpful. As we wrap up, let's remember these best practices. Only use tables for data, not layout. Always designate row and column headers. Provide a meaningful caption and alt text for your table. And use the built-in table tools for proper accessibility settings. Thank you for joining this Accessibility Byte. Accessible tables equals seamless navigation. We'll see you next time.